Antonio Lucio Vivaldi was born on March 4, 1678. He was baptized almost immediately after birth by a midwife, and some people speculate that he was rushed to this due to fear for his life. It isn't certain whether he was sick or if it was because of an earthquake that shook Venice earlier that day. His parents were Giovanni Battista Vivaldi and Camilla Calicchio, and he also had 8 siblings. Vivaldi's father was a barber, but eventually became a professional violinist. He likely taught young Vivaldi the beginnings of violin very early on, and they toured around together. Giovanni helped found a musician association called Sovegna dei Musicisti di Santa Cecilia, and through that connection was able to introduce young Antonio to many professional musicians and composers, like the president of the organization, Giovanni Lagrenzi. Lagrenzi was himself a composer early on in the Baroque era, and probably taught Antonio composition. Music scholars have been able to hear tinges of Lagrenzi's style in Vivaldi's early works, such as his Laetatus Sum, written at the age of 13. By 15, he was studying to become a priest. 10 years later, he was ordained, but was given a dispensation only 1 year later. In his short time in the clergy, his nickname, the Red Priest, or Il Prete Rosso, was created due to his red hair. He eventually had to leave the clergy because he was chronically short of breath, probably caused by asthma. This also hindered his ability to play any wind instruments, but he could still play violin and compose just fine. It was 1703 that saw him become a master of violin at Pio Ospedale della Pietà, or the Devout Hospital of Mercy. It was here that he worked for 30 years, composing most of his most famous works. The building served as an orphanage and taught boys a trade and girls music. As per his job requirements, he wrote concerti, cantatas, and sacred music. Vivaldi's recognition as an exemplary, virtuosic violinist shone through his pupils, and many of them left to become world-famous musicians. He also taught a special bass viol called a viola all'inglese, and the choir for some time. It took a long time for the other teachers at the Ospedale to appreciate Vivaldi's role there, and in their annual vote on whether to keep certain teachers, it was often a disputed vote. In 2009, he was actually voted to be fired, and was a freelance musician for about a year until he was invited back to teach again. Obviously, the orphanage must have seen how important he was to the music community there. He was hired back and promoted to Maestro de Concerti, and ran the entire music department in 1716. He had his first 3 opuses published during this time. His first was a series of sonatas for 2 violins and Basso Continuo, and the second, more sonatas, this time for violin solo and Continuo. His third opus was a major achievement, a collection of 12 concerti for varying sizes of strings with orchestra, titled L'Estro Armonico. This last work was dedicated to the Grand Prince Ferdinand of Tuscany, who took a liking to Vivaldi. The prince hired many historically famous musicians to sponsor his works, including Alessandro Scarlatti and even George Friedrich Handel. In February of 1711, Vivaldi's father and he traveled to Brescia in northern Italy to have his own setting of the Stabat Mater performed in a festival. Although the work seemed to have been a product of short time and seems rather simplistic and repetitious, it is recognized as one of his early masterpieces. Opera was massively popular in 18th century Venice, and Vivaldi took this opportunity and wrote many. His first was commissioned in 1713, Ottone in Villa, which was performed in Vicenza. He got another opera performed the next year, but was received rather coolly by audiences. He got another opera performed the next year, but was received rather coolly by audiences, where its performance schedule was cut short after only 3 weeks. Late into the 1716 season, he wrote another opera, called Arsilda Regina de Ponto, but was blocked by the state censor due to its controversial material. In it, the lead female role, Arsilda, falls in love with a woman who's pretending to be a man. However, the next year it passed the censor and became a very successful work. The orphanage also commissioned several vocal works, and 2 rather important oratorios were written in this time. The first one's score was lost to time. The second, however, Juditha Triumphans, was massively successful and performed many times. It is in 11 parts, and when it was first performed, all parts were performed by musicians and vocalists of the Ospedale, which were all girls. This, Arsilda, and 2 other operas were all written in 1 year. In 1717 or 18, he moved to Mantua to be the maestro of the court of Prince Philip of Hesse-Darmstadt. He was there for 3 years and composed many more operas. He moved to Rome in 1722 to perform for Pope Benedict XIII. In 1725, he returned home to Venice, writing 4 operas in a single year. In this time, he wrote his highly famous Four Seasons, or Il cimento dell'armonia e dell'invenzione, Opus 8. This collection was written in a very new way for his time, which is often called program music. Each of the 12 concerti that make up the Four Seasons is based on something non-musical, such as thunderstorms, hunting parties, creeks, birds, and warming winter fires. Each concerto has a sonnet paired to it, likely all composed by Vivaldi also. During his stay in Mantua, he became closely acquainted with a local singer named Anna Tessieri-Giro. Many questioned their relationship as being romantic, but Vivaldi rejected those claims in a letter to a patron in 1725. He was highly sought as a composer for European royalty, and wrote many arias, concerti, and cantatas, including his Gloria e Magno, commissioned in 1725 for the marriage of Louis XV. He also composed his Opus 9, La Cetra, for Emperor Charles VI, who admired Vivaldi's music greatly. So much so, in fact, that their one conversation is said to have lasted longer than all of the ones that the emperor had collectively with some of his ministers. Vivaldi was knighted by Emperor Charles, given a medal, and invited to stay in Vienna, Austria. Vivaldi worked with a couple famous writers of the time to compose even more operas: L'Olympiade, Ottone and Utica, and La Griselda in 1730. Vivaldi and his father also traveled to Prague and Vienna to have one of his most famous operas, Farnace, performed. As is too often the case in the composer's life, as Vivaldi reached his end years, he began falling out of public interest as his works became dated. He would sell scores in bulk in order to fund his migration to Vienna. He likely left Venice, Italy, to take up the emperor's offer. Shortly after he arrived in Vienna, however, Charles VI died, and Vivaldi was left largely stranded. He quickly became impoverished and died on July 28, 1741, at the age of 63, and died of what was catalogued as internal infection. His burial site was modest and paid for by a public hospital. His funeral was at the famous St. Stephen's Cathedral, but Joseph Haydn, the cathedral's composer at the time, likely didn't have anything to do with it because no music was performed at the funeral. His Venice home was leveled, and a hotel now is in its place, and the church he was buried next to was also torn down and replaced by the Technical Institute. There have been 2 plaques placed at both locations, as well as a star at the Venice Musikmele and a monument at the Rooseveltplatz. So, what effect did Vivaldi's style have on music in the long run? Johann Sebastian Bach was deeply moved by his music, and Vivaldi's style can be heard in Bach's St. John Passion, St. Matthew Passion, as well as his cantatas. He also transcribed many of Vivaldi's works for different ensembles. Besides that, however, Vivaldi's music was largely ignored after his death, and for over 200 years, through the classical and romantic eras, his music, even the Four Seasons, was by and large unknown. It wasn't until the early 20th century that Vivaldi had his revival. This was likely pushed forward by Fritz Kreisler's Concerto in C, in the style of Vivaldi. French scholar Marc Buncherle began to study Vivaldi's collected works, wherein many of his works were rediscovered and compiled by the Turin National University Library. Many composers and music enthusiasts then began listening to Vivaldi's music and was once again brought to the public attention. In 1939, Alfredo Casella organized a special Vivaldi Week, where some of his pieces that were newly rediscovered and performed for the first time in centuries. Especially after World War II, his music saw great success and appreciation. Performances of his work on period instruments, and not their modern variants, only increased his popularity further. As recently as 10 years ago, Vivaldi's music is still being rediscovered and performed. For instance, his 1730 opera Argippo was rediscovered in 2006 by Ondřej Maček and performed 2 years later, 278 years after its last performance. In what is perhaps his biggest performance yet, I uploaded his Four Seasons in its entirety, performed by the Budapest Strings, conducted by Bela Bonfalvi in 2011. It grew very slowly at first, but eventually, about halfway into 2012, exploded, and in a sort of warpath keeps climbing upwards in views. I haven't been able to find a good reason for the erratic behavior of views day by day. But with that, I give you a snippet of Vivaldi's life. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed compiling it, and I hope everyone continues to enjoy Vivaldi as I have this last 4 years. It is always enjoyable to read people's comments, both enlightening and humorous, and I hope I can keep putting out content that people will come to enjoy. Thank you for all your time. If you've enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments. Be on the lookout for future videos featuring composers and exploring different eras and topics of music. I've also created 3 other videos of different composers, one of Handel, which I believe everyone probably knows, Vishnogradsky, which was a 20th century microtonalist composer, and H. Wakabayashi, another microtonalist, but a modern day one. If you have a special composer or style you'd like me to feature, let me know in your comment. This is Evan Bennett, an American composer. Happy listening.